So here's part two on my analysis of why BRICS is a non-starter going forward. And originally this was going to be one video on domestic problems that those countries are having. But man, I went down a rabbit hole on one specific domestic problem that mainly China and Russia are facing. But you have to understand, China and Russia are two of the three main players when it comes to BRICS as an organization. Now, what I'm talking about is COVID policies, and it's strange for me to talk about COVID to fellow Americans because for the most part, as many Americans know, this is more of a back burner issue for us. We aren't really thinking about COVID as much as we used to. We've moved on to other things domestically, and because of that, we don't see it as much. Now, this latest strain, this Omicron BA2, and now the newest BA45 is the most virulent strains we've ever had. It's actually the most virulent strain of any disease, including malaria, that we've ever had. And we're having to deal with this globally. It's run through the United States. That's why we kind of see ebbs and flows in the US. And I don't know what the Europeans look like, but really in the US, we just get told by a color, because we like our color systems here, that we're in high, medium, or low, and we kind of make our own choices based on that. Now, China has said that because of these new, more virulent and potentially more deadly strains, they will continue their zero COVID policy for the next 5 years into 2027. Zero COVID was originally seen as a win in the pre-vaccine era. It's now an unmitigated disaster to continue a policy like that. In the US, we have a population where roughly 85% have received some sort of vaccine, whether you have 1, 2, or 3, maybe even more if you're ambitious, vaccines. I personally am vaccinated and boosted. I'll get reboosted when I get my flu shot in the fall. Additionally, we roughly rotate around 5 to 10% of people who are not vaccinated or who were vaccinated but still got COVID. So they have natural immunity. That means that roughly between vaccine and natural immunity, we meet the near 90% requirement to have a managed pandemic. We're largely over the pandemic phase, and now we're in just managing it as a daily part of our lives. And that means that we can weather in the US the new normal of COVID ups and downs. China cannot, because Sinovac is a trash vaccine. It was initially an okay vaccine when the first strains of COVID came out, and it showed that it was okay against Delta, but since then it's kind of nosedive into oblivion. And that's because when you go to the Delta to Omicron to BA2 to BA4 or 5, that vaccine can't react fast enough. Their companies can't react fast enough. Omicron is more transmissible than Delta. Western vaccine provides solid protection because we tweak boosters in real time. And those that are unvaxxed gain natural herd immunity. China has neither of those because they have a 14-month-old vaccine that hasn't been tweaked very much. And a zero COVID policy means that those that are stuck in their homes never actually get COVID. Now, that could be a good thing, but that also is a terrible thing for a community or a country when a major version of this or a major variant of COVID comes roaring through and they have to lock down everything. Like I said, China doesn't have an mRNA vaccine. They can't customize rapidly. It's even been shown that having 3 doses of Sinovac does not protect at all against Omicron. This is very bad for them. So what does the next 5 years look like in the largest BRICS economy due to their self-imposed zero COVID policy? Well, there's going to be ongoing lockdowns. Shanghai just came out of a lockdown a month ago, and it almost went back into one a couple days ago because there's just been flare-ups. Beijing came out of a lockdown 4 days ago. And these aren't the half-assed type lockdowns that we experienced, where we're like, yeah, we're locked down, but piss on you, government. I'm still going to the grocery store. What are you going to do? These are hardcore police-enforced lockdowns. These are fully authoritarian lockdowns that have a major impact to their economy, which is why China won't grow at the 5.5% rate they originally anticipated, but rather more like 3%. And if that holds, it'll be the first time in decades the U.S. growth has outpaced China's. This will be the new normal for China. Their economy being stunted by their terrible COVID policies. Russia is largely in the same boat. I mean, if you hadn't heard, Moscow is currently on a 10-day lockdown for COVID because it's running rampant through them. That's because they have a major vaccine problem too. Russia's Sputnik, while slightly better than Sinovac's vaccine, is not being taken by the Russian people because Russian people will obey their government, but they don't trust their government. So even Sputnik is not very effective. And side note, it's the most eye-rolly name for a vaccine. We get it. You were first. Doesn't mean you were the best. Same with the space program, as we showed. It's a viral vector vaccine. That's similar to Johnson & Johnson's vaccine. But when people don't trust you enough to take it, it doesn't even matter. And speaking of the Sputnik vaccine, fellow BRICS member, Brazil, flat out rejected it. Like, decided to turn ships around full of it and say, we don't want your vaccine. Instead, it used the G7 member, US FDA-approved Pfizer vaccine, and other fellow G7 member, UK AstraZeneca vaccines. Meaning Brazil is actually largely in good shape. Now they're going through a fourth wave or they just came out of one, but with their high vaccine rate with effective vaccines, they've managed their COVID very well. But they managed it with Western vaccines, Western technology, reliance on the West, not reliance on its fellow BRICS members. BRICS didn't play a part in Brazil. India uses the UK's AstraZeneca vaccine and then developed one themselves. And both are far better than China and Russia's vaccines. They don't use any BRICS vaccines. They use G7 developed vaccines. South Africa uses a US Johnson & Johnson vaccine, US Pfizer vaccine, and a UK AstraZeneca vaccine. No one in BRICS, if you hadn't seen, wants the garbage Russia and Chinese vaccines. I feel like the Russians and the Chinese don't want the Russian and Chinese vaccines, but that's all they got. Hell, we had told you earlier that Russians are rejecting their own vaccine. If you just watch on the news or read on the internet how bad things are going in China with regard to COVID or how bad things are going with regard to COVID in Russia, you see why their vaccines are ineffective and why policies are bad there. Meanwhile, the US alone has donated 500 million effective vaccines and plans to donate an additional 1.1 billion by the end of 2023. The United Kingdom has donated 100 million. US and UK vaccines have been administered worldwide for free to very grateful nations. Russia and China have done fuck all. Even Hong Kong uses a mix of Pfizer vaccines and Sinovac vaccines. Taiwan used Moderna until it developed, which is made by the US, until it developed its own vaccine. There is no player in BRICS doing any kind of good here. And the world knows it. It was the US, the United Kingdom, and other G7 nations that stepped up and said, we're working this problem, we'll get it out to you, and we'll get it to you for free. BRICS did nothing. They had nothing to do with it. In fact, they were so much of a nothing to do with it that BRICS nations were using Western vaccines. So going forward, this is going to continue. China's going to have major problems economically because of its zero COVID policy, among other things that I'll talk about later. Russia continues to have problems, even though they never admit it. I've never seen a more lying group of fucking people as a country, maybe other than North Korea. But this COVID situation is not going away for these countries, whereas many of us, especially in the US, have moved on and our economy has reflected that. Our economy is starting to run hot in the US, which is why we're having these inflationary issues right now. But you can see that our employment's returned and a lot of things have returned, not to normal, but at least a more normal than what you see in China and Russia. And that's going to be a major problem for them if they want to try and compete with any other economic group around the world.